Welcome to the Wellbeing and Career World podcast. I'm delighted to be chatting with Lesley Cooper. Lesley is a management consultant with over 25 years experience in the design and delivery of all elements of employee wellbeing management programs. In 1997, Lesley founded WorkingWell, an award-winning specialist consultancy that helps companies to manage workplace pressure in a way that facilitates growth and development. With her team at WorkingWell, Lesley designs and delivers programs that enable clients to see how workplace pressure is being experienced by their employees and use this information to empower every team and team member to get the best from themselves and each other, so that they can perform sustainably and healthily to the highest standard. WorkingWell was shortlisted for Best Wellbeing Service Provider at the Great British Workplace Wellbeing Awards 2021. She is co-author with the late Dr. Stephen Williams of Dangerous Waters, Strategies for Improving Wellbeing at Work, published by John Wiley & Sons, and Managing Workplace Stress, a best practice blueprint published by CBI Books. Lesley's latest book, Brave New Leader, How to Transform Workplace Pressure into Sustainable Performance Growth, and co-author is Vicky Smith. And on today's podcast, we'll be chatting about workplace wellness, or branding Charade, the workplace wellbeing debate, and a very well welcome to the podcast, Lesley Cooper. How are you today, Lesley?
Good morning. Yes, I'm great. Thank you very much.
She's lying. Don't mind. We spoke before the recording started, and we both have little sniffles, so we do apologise just in case. But no, she is sounding wonderful. So to let our listeners know, Lesley, where are you right now on planet Earth?
I am on the Surrey-Kent border, which is not covered in snow, but is quite frosty and chilly. It is very chilly.
Is Surrey very posh for anybody wanting to travel the parts of the UK?
It's very pretty. It's quite expensive, I would say. The cost of a burger here is quite high.
Right, okay.
There are better places to have lunch.
What would your TripAdvisor rating be, Lesley, if you were to entice somebody to go and visit Surrey? Was that movie The Holiday made there, was it?
Yes, it was. One of the characters was from this area. Yeah, I think she's from not this particular part of Surrey, but she was. It's a great place. There's loads and loads and loads of things to do. And if you like the M25, you can sit on that for quite some time as well. It goes through a lot of Surrey. You can see quite a lot of Surrey from the M25.
Yes. And temperature-wise, how chilly are we today?
Today here it is. It's just hovering above freezing, but it was -6 last night, which is why the garden's covered in frost.
So okay, I'll give a little bit of an introduction about your background. So can you let the listeners know a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. I have run a business called WorkingWell since 1997, long time, and originally started my career working for I think the country's leading health insurance company, but on the health insurance side, and then the sort of middle part of my career, when I was thinking about having children and stuff, I kind of transitioned out of insurance onto the health and wellbeing side. In fact, it didn't really exist in the late 90s. It was very much a health insurance business, but the business was obviously aware that we needed to move into health more than sickness, because health insurance is all about sickness. And I was at the sort of very beginning of that product development cycle. I was specifically interested in building a proposition for the corporate market to help them manage sickness absence in those days, because sickness absence was something that was sort of just accepted and wasn't really thought of as something you could influence. But when people started to think about it, they realised that what keeps people off sick from work is either musculoskeletal problems predominantly, or psychosocial ones. And that's how really I finished up, 35 years later, still being very interested in the relationship between emotional mental health at work and performance and attendance and presence and engagement and all those things. So I've always really been in this kind of space, from the very beginning.
And what was it, Lesley, that kind of like the turning moment that you kind of, you had the passion for well-being? What was that like, kind of like, like the kind of light in the sky that said, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life?
It's a great question, because the truth of it was that when I left to have my first child, I was in insurance, and then I experienced what it's like to raise a small child that was born a little bit early and so didn't sleep, and go back to work and hold down a corporate job, with, BMWs and shoulder pads in those days.
The shoulder pads, yeah.
And a small child. And I was asked to get involved in a project around scoping out a project for stress management, for the organisation to sell a proposition that would help organisations manage sickness, absence and stress, particularly on the basis that that's what people were avoiding. If people didn't go to work, it's because there was something in the workplace they didn't want to get to. And we could put that under the label of stress. And I looked at the symptoms and I thought, oh my Lord, I have all of those. In terms of sort of fatigue and lack of confidence and, all the things that go with just being under pressure to have multiple roles and responsibilities. And pressure is a great thing, actually. It can produce wonderful outcomes. But if there's too much of it for your current set of coping strategies or skills, then you get a different outcome altogether. And this list of stress symptoms, I thought, oh my goodness, I have all of those. And so I kind of, is often the way, isn't it? When you can relate to something personally, it was very easy to see how that plays out inside a corporation and what those feelings would do in terms of your attendance at the simplest level. But if you choose to be present, what impact that would have on your performance. So it became, it was an emotional interest and light bulb moment, but it became a kind of intellectual pursuit thereafter, because it's like, how does that play out? And the more time I spend in the space talking to individuals, employees and their employers, the closer I see the connection is between stress and poor performance, because they're not compatible. We're not wired to do our best work when we're feeling, when we're triggered by the stress reaction.
So Lesley, when you were wearing your Miami Vice shoulder pads and you had your young child, and you're feeling this kind of like fatigue and stress, and on a personal level, I mean, did you get the sympathy from your employer that maybe you thought you might have done, because maybe they see you, that you have a new child, you might be tired, you might be sleeping, you're trying your best, or was that sympathy there at all, or did they really care?
Honestly, David, I think they did care. But
right.
The culture was just so different in those days. So, well, you've chosen to come back to work. Here you are. I feel that's one of the good things that's happened about the increase in interest in well-being at work and how the effect of work on life and life on work. I think there's much more awareness that people are in a when, as we often say, when you employ someone, the whole person comes to work, not just the bit that does the job, So
yes.
I think there's much more awareness of that now than there was at the time. It's sort of like, well, you get the minute you revolve in through the revolving door, on goes the work mask, and what's going on for you outside of work isn't really our concern. And I think that's what's different, that organisations recognise that they can't necessarily control it, but it is their concern, and it should be within their circle of concern, because what's going on for people outside of work affects their ability to perform at their best and to bring their full self to work, which is what you need these days, because we can't solve our productivity problems by simply getting more people, although we'd all like that, and that's not really possible. So that awareness of the connection between what's going on outside for people and accommodating that, not just being sympathetic to it, but empathic to it, is one of the best things that's happened, I think, in the last 10 years. It's got a long way to go, but it's, it's going in the right direction.
So this amazing term that we hear a lot, well-being or workplace well-being. So can you explain generally what it is? I mean, we see it plastered kind of different corporations, companies in the media and so on. So what is probably the most simplistic way of explaining workplace well-being or well-being in general?
It's a great question. I mean, put really simply, it's a good day at work. if you sort of reducing it down to its absolute sort of essential oil, it's having a good day at work, and good in both directions. Not good as in, I sat in a corner and I got away with doing nothing, because I don't think there's anyone in work these days who actually would have that attitude anyway. But it's a sort of symbiotic relationship where, you know, both the employee and the employer have benefited from the association. You know, that the employee had a great day at work, you know, felt fulfilled, felt engaged, felt energized, was, you know, interested in what they were doing, and feel that they made a contribution to that. And by doing that, the employer is happy because he got a return on his investment in that person, in terms of whatever it is, widgets, you know, if you make a thing, or creativity, or, you know, new ideas, or contribution, engagement, all those things. So it is a good day at work in both directions. That's, you know, the simplest way of describing it. I think as far as the way organizations are interpreting it, it's very variable. I think
Right.
For some people, it means, I think what we used to refer to, you know, in the late 90s, when all this started, was, you know, like lifestyle factors, you know, that we have a wellbeing program that, as one of my clients once described, not about their own organization, by the way, but just sort of like, it's a little bit more than sweatbands and apples, you know, but there are still companies who are perhaps approaching it as, so long as we provide the sweatbands and the apples, you know, we'll be okay. We've got a wellbeing strategy. There'll be the other end of the spectrum, who are the companies that we tend to get on well with. And we work with all organizations. Wherever they're starting, it's important they do something, so we can work with all of them. But at the other end of our spectrum would be the organizations who've grasped that you need to involve the employees in that. They are the people who are trying to have the good day at work, and therefore you have to ask them, what does it feel like to work here? And to then align your activities and interventions to meet those needs, rather than just assume that, you know, this will be beneficial. Because the bizarre thing that happens when we talk to individuals who are, you know, for want of a better word, stressed or overwhelmed, is that you get a situation where they feel guilty that they can't access all this help that's provided for them because they're too busy.
Right.
Interesting, you know, which adds to their pressure. You know, I feel pressure to use these things because my company's been really kind of providing them for me, but I just can't find the time to use the gym or whatever. So in the literature, well-being is this sort of confluence of being, it's not the absence of disease. It's about being, if you imagine a Venn diagram with three circles, you know, with one of them being physical, the other one being mental, and the other one being social health, where they coincide in the middle, that's considered to be well-being. So, you know, in order to be well, you need to be broadly, you know, physically, mentally, and socially well. And when those three things comes together, that could be defined as well-being. I think these days you'd have to add financial health into that as well, because obviously that's a big impact for most people. But it's a simple term, but it's interpreted in many, many different ways by different people. But that's what it means to us.
Do you think, Lesley, I mean, to go back further to our school days, or when we're growing up and we're learning our maths and our English and French and so on, do you think it could be a good practice? You mentioned there the financial side as well, that maybe the school curriculum, and this is only an opinion question for yourself, everybody's out there kind of saying, oh, you can't say this, you can't say that, but do you think it's a good idea or suggestion maybe to bring that within the school curriculum, that children from a young age learn about well-being, and they learn about how to manage stress, and they learn about how to manage money? Is that something for the future, or is that happening now?
I would say it is happening. It's certainly happening in the independent sector, interestingly enough. I mean, I'm a chair of a school governing board, so I know a little bit about this. And obviously in the independent sector, where you tend to have very high performing, or perhaps have a kind of concentration of high performing kids, it becomes more of a necessity, really, because in order to operate at the level that the children and their parents, I would perhaps say their parents, want them to operate at, there are certain decisions that have to be made in terms of how you manage your personal resources. And I do think that there's an awareness that, you know, even in the schools, that performance, even when you're in school, is affected by the way you manage your personal resources, you know, that might be something as simple as making sure, as it is in the corporate world, making sure that you take appropriate recovery Having your phone taken off you is not necessarily a great plan. Maybe you should, do an hour's worth of homework, fully engaged, and then spend 40 minutes or 30 minutes on Instagram or whatever it is that brings you joy, and then,
Yes.
then go back to work rather than being pinned into your bedroom by yourself, by fear of your teachers or by fear of your parents for 4 hours, grinding through your homework, then going to bed being chased by the number 9,
Yeah.
because you didn't have any appropriate recovery before you tried to go to sleep. The same story actually is kind of in corporate wellbeing about managing, recognizing that you can't do it all and you have to make some decisions how you use yourself and what quality of attention you're going to give to things if you're going to give it your attention, because while you're doing that, you can't be doing something else. So you might as well, don't multitask and give it your full attention. So I think the schools generally are aware of that. And I think it does make sense generally anyway, because we live in a world where the amount of demands on your attention are so very much greater than your ability to respond to them all, that you do need some skills in the 21st century that you probably didn't need when we were growing up, about data discernment, about managing your focus, and about accepting actually that you can't, doesn't matter if you going faster won't necessarily enable you to get it all done. You've got to make some decisions about how you use your what we would call your personal energy resources, in order to meet life's demands. So I think it's starting. I think we could do more. Certainly a lot of kids arrive at universities where they come out of an institutionalized environment where you're told what to do and how to do it. And it becomes more self-directed learning, and all the constraints are off in terms of self-regulation, and they can't cope. It takes a little while to find the skills and learn the skills to make those decisions. So I think there's a lot we could do to prime people for that more generally, but also so that when they do go into the world of work, they can not expect their employer to solve all their problems for them, because you do have to practice a certain amount of personal responsibility for your own well-being, I think. That was a long answer, wasn't it? I bet you.
No, it was a good answer. Because I think as well, even with the personal responsibility, I mean, with having these well-being programs within an organization or any place generally, can there be a risk of the staff or employee milking the system, so to speak? If for example, the companies say, if you need 3 days off a year, you're going to get 3 days off a year. Can that have a kind of a negative effect as well, by the employee thinking, well, I can get 3 days off, irrelevant if I don't feel sick or I don't need it? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's interesting. It's a very interesting question, because the whole interest in managing sickness absence at work, funnily enough, like I said, 35 years ago now, whatever it is, started from an assumption that could be the case. That there used to be this word called malingering. You don't hear it anymore, malingering. That, if you gave people discretionary days, they would make sure they took them because they were offered, and that kind of attitude permeated the whole workplace. And I think it's become a little bit clearer that it's unlikely that that's going to be the case even then, and certainly isn't the case now. So I think providing wellbeing services doesn't necessarily in itself increase demand for them. As I've just said, quite the opposite. I think people are grateful sometimes that these things are there, but they struggle to find the time to use them because there's just so much to do. And most of the companies that we work with and most of the people that we speak to in a kind of therapeutic environment, because we work at all ends of the spectrum, from the preventative all the way down to the, people who have already been affected by life events or by overwhelm or whatever. And what they tell us is that they're operating inside an environment where it just feels like it doesn't really matter how you organize yourself. There's too much to do. There's simply not enough resource to go around. And that may or may not be the case. It's quite a sweeping statement to say that, there's too much to do. But there's a general sense in our diagnostic tools, something like between 60 and 70% of any work group you speak to will say they feel pressure from a sense of having too much to do in too little time. That means it doesn't matter how I organise the deck chairs on this boat, it feels like it's going down.
I like the way you said that.
Yeah. And the band plays on,
The band plays on.
I think that it's unlikely, therefore, that people have the bandwidth to say, "Oh, well, I'll take that duvet day because it's offered." Because what I see is that people are so committed, so engaged. We recruit for this level of engagement, don't we? They're so committed and so engaged in what they're doing. Certainly the white collar sector, maybe a little bit different in the blue collar, but people are so engaged in what they're doing that they struggle to find the time to even go home when they're supposed to go home, let alone taking additional days because they're offered. So I don't think it's much of a risk, to be fair.
Lesley, do you think then that, as we talk about well-being and from two sides, say the company side and the employee or the individual side, is it more of a brand or a branding exercise for the company? And then for the opposite side, just in case I can hear some screaming going on, shouting at me in the background, what about an employee who's quite skeptic? They're kind of, I don't believe in this nonsense that the company is kind of throwing out there. So from both sides, what would you say for and against?
Yeah, I think most organisations, if I'm honest, are authentic in their thinking and their motivation to provide these services. Let's put that out there. I think there's very little evidence that people are deliberately cynical. This is the corporation, deliberately cynical about what they're providing. Put simply, well, if we provide all of this, then we can just drive them harder and harder and harder. That is not a conversation that I have ever heard, actually. I think there is, however, a disconnect between organisations thinking that by providing all of these services, they are managing well-being as well as they can. I think it's important that these services are provided. And I often think it's a little bit like a buffet, and just like at weddings, the buffet, when you first come out, there's this wonderful array of gloriously presented food. It's all very similar, often pastry based with sausages in it, different forms of pastry. But there it all is, and it's beautiful. And like an hour and a half in, about 10% of it has gone, and the rest of it has been rearranged. And 10% of it's gone to the people who are really hungry and needed it. And the rest has been sort of picked and grazed over. And I think, in a way, I'm seeing this. I don't know how popular this will be as an analogy, but I am seeing a lot of the wellbeing offerings that companies are providing as being a bit like that. It looks good, but actually ultimately unsatisfying because it doesn't really meet the appetites of the people that are present. And so a lot of it gets wasted and left behind, and not used. And I think a lot of people would agree with that. They know they spend a lot of money on these things and they're not really sure that the uptake, the engagement with these things is as high as they would like it to be. And that's because it probably doesn't meet the needs. Or, as we said earlier, they're so busy they can't get at them. So I think the intention is always honourable, but I think it's unfortunate that the objective is not always met, but not through any cynical reason, just because they're just not matched up terribly well. As far as the individual employee is concerned, I think, again, it's mixed. I think probably if you put a number on it, 4 out of 5 of the people that we would speak to would recognise the attempt that their company is making to provide services to manage their well-being. The other 1 in 5, the other 20%, will be quite cynical about it and say they're doing this, but they're doing this because they don't want to address the real issue, which is that there aren't enough people here to do the work. Right. And that's their belief. And therefore it looks to them like a cynical attempt at just, squeezing more blood out of the stone, perhaps.
Is it a perception thing as well, Lesley? So if you're kind of sold a dream of, and I'm being sarcastic here, bean bags and free tea, free coffee, free meals, and this type of stuff, and your perception is, oh wow, this is pretty cool, pretty amazing, and then you go in then to the company and you're worked like a dog. Is it sometimes better to reduce your expectations and just accept that this is what the company offers, but I'm here to do a job, take the money and run.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I think a lot of people who find themselves in that situation kind of knew that was the organization they were going to be working for anyway. I don't think there's very few people that I come across these days who don't expect to have to work very hard, and they accept that. I think that, the cynicism comes from the belief that, or from the thought that possibly the company is providing these services and describing themselves in one way, but is actually performing and asking them to perform in a way that's fundamentally different. In other words, the kind of mission and vision and values doesn't actually line up with what's happening or what they're being asked to do on a daily basis. And on that basis, they, become even more cynical about the services that are offered because they don't even seem to be worth using. Because my day-to-day reality is that you don't really care about me, and therefore I'm not going to collude with you by using your services, because I just don't think they're being offered for the right reason. But most people, I think, would see that. I think it's less the services and more the recognition that you might want a life outside of work, and that's what's starting to be brought into wellbeing packages, about flexibility, about ability to practice hybrid working in a way that makes sense to you. These are the things that people value. But if they find out that when they get there they're still expected to be into the office, we said you could work from home, but actually we'd really prefer it if you didn't, then that's when the problem starts, because you have been sold a bit of a lie, really. And I think that's when the cynicism sets in.
It's interesting you say that, because that was kind of I'm going to lead on to that question, is that when initially you say you join an organization or a company and they have all these wonderful well-being systems in place, or benefits, and then maybe 6 months or 9 months into the company, they give their results, the company results, the profits are down. They still made 1.3 billion, but we're going to take this away, we're going to take that away. Kind of adding on to what you said there, does that lead more to the negativity then, and more skeptic approach from an individual? Because we had that, and they're still made 1 point something billion or 2 billion, but they want to take away, my coffee in the morning or my free tea. Does that add to the problems?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely does. There's no doubt about that, and we see that a lot in organizations that are taken over. This is another way it happens, that you have a company who's got a kind of local management that gets it, is investing in a good example was a company we were working with who had on-site emotional support services, which is quite a commitment, 1 day a week to have somebody available who we supplied to talk to people at the stage when you're, before it's become overwhelmed, but just I don't know, if you can get people at the stage where they're starting to feel unsettled, which happens quite a long time before people, when people are in that strain zone before they become overwhelmed, that's a good time to kind of give people some things they can think about and some actions, and perhaps refer them on to other services that the company might have. And this was working extraordinarily well. And in fact, the girls they were there for 1 day a week, 8 appointments a day. They had a waiting list of 3 weeks. And the company was taken over by another company who axed the service straight away and said, we can spend that money in a different way. And it was very difficult for the organisation, for the people that we were speaking with in the organisation, and some of the people that we were having to sever that relationship with, to get their head round how can we take the company seriously when they say they're interested in our well-being, and we have a service that has got a waiting list of a month, and it's being axed for reasons of cost, which is a drop in the ocean compared to what the company was making and what they will have just paid for the company they bought, So it is a real thing, because at the end of the day, even a very generous wellbeing package with generous everything is still usually a very, very small proportion of your salary cost, and certainly your profit cost, or your profit level. So, it is hard, isn't it, to get your head around whether it's really, really honest that we really do care about your well-being when it's only a very tiny cost, and we'll have that. But if we're cost saving, we'll have that. It's difficult to keep that kind of
optimism.
Yeah, exactly. Difficult to keep that thought out of your head, isn't it?
It's interesting because there's one company I worked for years ago, and it always stood out in my mind, and it was Singapore Airlines. And when I joined, because I came from kind of a Western company culture, and when I joined there, they had once a month, they had this kind of like every Friday. It was like not a meeting, but it was kind of, it probably was, it was actually a meeting, but you had like management there, and you had somebody there to take notes, and they just kind of asked you, okay, what's the problems? What do we need to do to make this better? What do we need to fix this? And it was interesting because at the first probably couple of meetings, I was kind of cynical. What's this all about? But in fairness, they actually did try their very best to change things, and they involved everybody and integrated everybody. And that's one thing I haven't seen, Lesley, in any company since then that I've actually worked with or worked for. And I find it kind of interesting. Is it then, to lead on to my question, is it important then to maybe have like a company meeting with all the staff maybe once a month, an open thing where you can have like a bit of food, very relaxed atmosphere? And is it important to have, say, one or two people that you can actually go to in the event that you have an issue or a problem or you need well-being supports, rather than just having the information there, and as you mentioned before, you're just too busy to find it, or you're too busy to ask somebody for help? What's your take on that?
Absolutely. You've hit on something super important there. And there's two things. We'll deal with the second one first, because if we go to the other one, we could be here for 10 minutes. The access to somebody that you trust to talk to is absolutely critical. It's related to the second point anyway, about how safe people feel around their leadership, how psychologically safe people feel around their leadership and around their colleagues, or whether they feel it's safe to access any of these services anyway. That if it became known that you rang the employee assistance program and took up your offer of 4 or 5 telephone counselling services, that somehow you would be seen as weak at the simplest level. And there's still a bit of a stigma with that knocking around, that if there's a certain way of being, and if you're not like that, then somehow you're diminished, and that you're not quite as good as the next person who could cope, and you couldn't cope, so you had to go and talk to somebody. I think that's all changed, thankfully, but there is still a concern in some organisations, or we have a concern that some organisations, it's not clear where these services are, and it's not necessarily as easy for them to be accessed confidentially and anonymously as people might like. And that's why we knew this on-site service was that's one of the reasons why it was so popular, because it was absolutely light touch. There was no stigma associated with going to, it was positioned as kind of tea and sympathy, really, to give people somewhere to go to offload a little bit, and then decide from then on whether they were just having a bad day today, or in fact I've been having a bit of a bad month, and the general direction of travel is that I'm probably experiencing some well-being issues, keeping it simple. So accessibility to somebody or some service that you trust is really important. Ideally, and this is where the leadership component comes in, being led or managed locally by people who you feel have got your back, who you can say, do you know what? I'm struggling a bit, or I don't know how I'm going to do this new thing that you've asked me to do because I'm already overwhelmed. Just that very simple, can we have a chat about how we could restructure my workload because I'm already kind of extending the working day, and I'm working evenings and weekends as well. And I'm running out. My elbows are now on the wall. I don't really have anywhere else to go. Feeling you can have that conversation at that point, or better still, before you get to that point, is really, really important. And when we're talking about well-being these days, that's the sort of thing we should be focusing on, really, how easy it is for people to access support when they feel they need it. But it's related to the second point, which is what you were saying about Singapore Airlines, about employee involvement, and creating the sort of culture. The buzzword is all about psych safety at the moment, psychological safety. A psychologically safe workplace is one where employees feel able, better still, are invited, but feel able to share their thoughts and insights about what's going on, about how we're doing things, about how we might be able to do things a little bit better. Or even, heaven forbid, express an opinion that's different to that of your leader, which may, in fact, speed our progress in the right direction, instead of us all, doffing caps and saying, that sounds like a good plan, thinking, that's never going to work. We don't have the resources anymore in companies to be able to disappear down those rabbit holes. So current leadership thinking, and thank goodness it's here, but it's taking a little while to embed, because it does require leaders to change their way of leading sometimes, is about asking questions. The technical term for it is humble inquiry, asking a question to which you do not already know the answer, and feeling able to say to your employees who are considerably less senior than you, I don't know how we're going to solve this problem. What do you think? Because the thoughts in those heads that are sitting down there looking at you are invaluable. But people will not share them if they don't feel it's safe to do so. In the same way, they won't share, which is why I said this is related to the first point. They won't share their emotional or well-being problems with leaders or even their colleagues if they don't feel safe around them, if they feel there'll be negative consequences in any form, either, hopefully not career limiting ones. Surely we're not working in that sort of environment anymore. But if a negative consequence could just be feeling that you've lost the respect of your colleagues, or your manager doesn't think you're for them, there are many, many ways in which, people are busy always practicing impression management, and if you think that by articulating this thought or this idea that people would think less of you, it's safer to sit on your hands and say nothing. But if you don't need me to spell out what a waste that is in terms of doing more with the same resources, because you've got all this new thought and ideas and ways perhaps to experiment, to do things differently and better, that just stay locked up inside the employee. So your question about half an hour ago was, is it important to have this sort of format? Absolutely. I mean, I've spent most of my working life trying to get this point across, that you can buy the other services, do that. It's important. It's really important that we have these safety nets for people. And yes, we should try and do what we can to help our employees develop the skills to cope with living and working in the 21st century, because we're not born with them, because the world has changed so much. And many of our upbringings, we were just saying in relation to, how you went through school, haven't necessarily prepared us for the sheer pace of life and the overload of information and demands on your attention. So there's a lot that organizations can do to help people become, for want of a better word, resilient to that, to manage their personal resources in a way that helps them, meet those challenges head on without being kind of knocked over by them. But that should always be supplemented by opportunities to do exactly what you were doing at Singapore Airlines, and probably better done locally, I think, because the trouble with having senior leadership is that you're a bit, even with the most psychologically safe environments, he was still the big boss though. So
Yes.
I'm a bit scared. But you should be able to have a psychologically safe conversation with your local leadership about, why are we doing it like this? What about if we did it like that? And get involvement on the things that are causing people the pressure in the first place. And that is best practice in any risk management model. You need primary, secondary, and tertiary interventions. Training and emotional support services are critical, but they're secondary and tertiary interventions. The magic happens when you combine those with employee input through that sort of Singapore Airlines type dialogue with the teams about what would better look like.
They're getting good advertisement today. They are, Lesley.
Yes, they are.
But you know something, I have to give them credit, because I think you mentioned there, even with the big boss and stuff like that, because even in the beginning, the bosses would actually integrate. You'd even have the CEO there, and it was an interesting thing you said there, like even with leadership. It was a great lesson for me on leadership that they did listen, they were receptive to feedback, and they knew it was for the greater good of the company. And that was something that always stuck with me for all these years. And I give them great credit, because I find myself, even now, I always compare different places that I've been or different places that I've worked to that environment. And although it took me a while to adapt, because you know yourself, Leslie, you can be quite, and this is anybody that's listening to this, you can be quite suspicious, you can again, of why is my boss here, and why is my boss so nice and friendly, and why is my CEO coming to this, and why, and you kind of have like, are they watching me, or you have this kind of like these thoughts, but then over time you realize actually no, they see the greater good in doing this, and if they get the information back,
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there's two things there, which reminds me to modify what I just said, that these conversations are best initiated locally, because they're less threatening because of all the things that you've just said. But what you need is it to go all the way through the organization. And because a local conversation doesn't go anywhere. I mean, obviously a local conversation should enable you to focus in on things that are within your sphere of influence. What these discussions are not supposed to do is for the manager to leave with a list of things he or she has got to implement as long as his arm. It's about the team being able to identify things that they can action. But there will be systemic things that the senior leadership could really benefit from hearing about. And so opportunities to have access to the senior leadership in the same way is also very reinforcing of the local discussion, but also particularly important because it gives the senior leadership, which is what they were getting. They may not have done this intentionally, but by creating environments where they connect with the people who actually do the job on a day-to-day basis, it's organizational learning for the leaders. They need this information. But it's almost like the nerve has been cut sometimes in some organisations that the senior leadership have very little opportunity to ever find out firsthand what it's like to be at the coalface, and that's information that they really do need to have. Or obviously, they can function without it, but you can't really put a price on that. Absolutely, real time insight into what's going on further down them in the organization. So there are enormous benefits in doing it locally, but there are also benefits in making sure that there are opportunities for this information to be fed directly into leadership for no other reason than the leadership will benefit from hearing it. And folding it into their other stock of information about the decisions they need to make for the organization. So they were possibly ahead of their time because it's being understood now, and you see a little bit more of it. But it's quite. I suspect at the time it was quite unusual, which is why you haven't found it replicated anywhere else. But it has to be genuine, which is the other thing. Because otherwise, because people do approach this with a sense of, inevitably, if it's not something that's happened before and suddenly all the senior leaders are swooping in and going, okay, so tell us about it, they're very unlikely to get much out of them for a while because you don't trust the process. but it's just about repeating it and giving people opportunities. And just like yourself, as you said, second or third iteration, go, okay, I'm going to put my hand up and say, because it doesn't look like there's been any negative consequences from any of the other things that have come up. So why don't I contribute? But you have to go slowly to start with.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. The last thing I'll say about this regards, they had this thing called just culture. And generally, if something happened within the company, for example, they wouldn't just automatically blame you, the individual. They would go back and kind of trace and go, okay, was he or she tired? Did we give them a night duty? Did we do this? Did we do that? Was this correct? Was that correct? And it would all go backwards. And then eventually it would come to you. But before it came to you, they would actually find out what may have caused you to make a mistake, or you know what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah. Kind of... Oh, absolutely. So, and they were obviously, they were ahead of their time, because, or rather, they were just doing it, and other people have put labels on it now, because that process of avoiding blame by cultivating curiosity is how it's done. Because things do go wrong. If you're trying to create a psychologically safe culture inside an organization so that people can, at the simplest level, tell you when they're about to go over the edge, so they don't have to use your wellbeing services, but on a more practical level, be innovative, feel safe to take what are known as interpersonal risks around each other, and just try a new approach, or share an idea that might sound really wacky in your head, but actually could be really valuable, or actually spot a mistake and own up to it at the time before it becomes critical, before it ends up getting worse or consuming more resources. All of that requires there to be no blame, because the minute there's the sniff of potential blame, everybody clams up, because fundamentally, without giving you a lesson in ancestral psychology, we are a team. We are a band, aren't we? Human beings are lived in bands. So acceptance by our group is a life or death matter in our ancestry. So we don't want to diverge from the group unless the group has given us permission to do so. So if we don't feel we have permission, if we feel we'll be judged or blamed for doing something different or expressing an idea that is not congruent with the group generally, that is uncomfortable. So you have to feel safe to do that. And the whiff of blame, potential blame, is enough to basically shut that whole risk-taking thing down. So how it's done is to build a culture inside an organization that is naturally curious when something went wrong or didn't work out. Why was that? Not who did that and
yes.
Why, but why did that happen, and what can we learn from it so that we can speed up the process, not make the same mistake again, and use the learning in a way that enables us to try again, but slightly differently. And, in other words, we can we get the business to understand the difference between intelligent failure and incompetence, because failures are rarely due to incompetence. They're just due to something not quite being right. So it's enormously exciting from a leadership perspective, just how much you can liberate from your existing team just by helping them feel a bit safer around you and around each other. But you have to practice it, and curiosity is the key to it. So yeah.
So well done, Singapore Airlines. We've spoken about it for the last 15 or 20 minutes, so congratulations. Anyway, Lesley, we'll move on then to, you're the founder of WorkingWell. So this is the business side, Lesley. This is time to sell yourself and the services. So go for it. What is WorkingWell, and what services does WorkingWell provide?
Okay, well, the clue's in the title, really. We've been very fortunate to have nabbed that in 1997, because it does a very good job for us, because it kind of explains the work. We're very into, the impact that wellness, for want of a better label, has on people's ability to work. So the performance side of the business, in terms of managing what might be called just psychosocial health risks generally, but stress. The business started out really looking at stress. How does stress, how does pressure, how does external factors and the way in which employees process those impacts their ability to perform well at a high standard and sustainably. So that's obviously the wellbeing connection from the performance perspective. So that if we understand the factors that can make people perform well, that are within our control, how can we organise our resources and our culture accordingly to enable everybody to come to work and bring their full selves to work so that they can have a good day at work. Yeah, so they can perform well, enjoy what they do, be engaged and fulfilled and creative and all those things. So it's these days more about how efficiently employees are working in relation to the pressures and demands that are on them, and what are the factors that are getting in the way, and what are the enablers and what are the disablers. So in that context, we provide a lot of this kind of 2 or 3 main strands to the work that we do. A lot of customers use us for measuring those factors in their workplace. So where do people feel pressure? How does it affect them? How is it impacting on their ability to maintain their boundaries between home and work? And how are they rating their good day at work? Are they energized and engaged, or are they approaching burnout and starting to think about looking for another job? So we do a lot of work in that space, but we also do a lot of work in leadership development to help managers do some of the things we've just been describing, really, about recognizing that when the people turn up, the whole person's come, not just a bit that does the job, and helping them to create a local culture where people can bring their full selves to work, be open and honest, creative, and love their job, and then go home and love their life as well, and still have a life, and feel able to recover appropriately so that when they are at work, they can bring their full selves. So that's I suppose these days labelled under kind of resilience, so we do a lot of team and personal resilience training for individuals and for managers, but also that leadership development piece around leading for wellbeing. How do you adapt very small adaptations to your natural, perhaps, way of leading to create the culture where people can be their full selves and give as much of themselves as they have to give without damaging them in the process, which is why it sits in the wellbeing space, because it's no good, flogging the horse if the horse then dies on the field. Yes. You want to keep running and run and come back and be joyful to jump for you again tomorrow. So, we're not mixing our metaphors there. So that's the kind of wellbeing and performance connection, because they are infinitely connected. But we also do provide therapeutic services as well, on-site and telephone counselling for individuals who and coaching for executive leaders, really, who are struggling to make that work for them. It's got out of balance somewhere, and help them to make the small step changes they need to get back. So wellbeing and performance. Working well. So are people well when they're working, and are they working as well as they can be? So that's the elevator speech. It's a very long and tall building.
And how then does, say, an individual or an organisation get in touch with you to start a process? And is the process an ongoing process, or is it like a block, maybe of, say, 1 day, 2 day kind of programs, or a week, or is it continuous, or is it just vary depending on what the clients want?
Yeah, and nearly every solution that we have in place in the world at the moment, and it is a global business, and we do a lot of, we have clients all over the world, it's variable to their needs. So, some of the biggest programs are, as I say, are global. They've got the diagnostic tools being used in 10 or 15 countries at once. And they've been, they run for several years, right down to a single 1 hour webinar for an organization who just wants to give their managers some tips on how to support people who come to them when they're struggling, how to spot people who are struggling, or in the middle of a whole program, perhaps of half a dozen, a cycle of energy management courses for employees so that they can, learn to use their resources better. Anywhere on that spectrum. I think these days, it's more fun to actually do the small dedicated pieces of work, and often this is how the big stuff started, often as a single workshop. 10 years later, it's grown into a global program. But most of the work we do starts with a simple, I've got a really high performing team that I'm worried about, can we have a conversation with them about sustainability, and that's often how it starts. Or I'm concerned that our managers don't really know how to support people, or I want to improve the level of mental health literacy in my leadership team, any of those. And they often start as single, very containable pieces of work, and they lead to other things. So we're very happy to join anywhere in the process because nearly everyone's doing something.
Yes.
So it's what we end up doing is complementing what they're already doing, or bringing what they've got together in a way so they get more return on their investment by integrating it a little bit, or even attaching it to some form of diagnostic or assessment tool so they can actually measure the progress that they're making. Because this is the other problem. We spend all this money, but people don't, because they don't know where their well-being started. They're not able to say that it's got better or worse because they never measured it at the beginning. So our assessment tools are quite popular for that purpose at the moment.
No, it's brilliant. I mean, you're way ahead of your time, as you said. It's you started this up when shoulder pads were in fashion, so you've really done well. Let's move on in regards to your books. So you are the co-author with the late Dr. Stephen Williams of Dangerous Waters: Strategies for Improving Wellbeing at Work and Managing Workplace Stress. And then the more recent one is Brave New Leader: How to Transform Workplace Pressure into Sustainable Performance and Growth. And just confirming, is that with Vicky Smith as well?
Yes. So Vicky and I have worked together for at least 10 years now. And Vicky's actually a registered psychotherapist, so she does a lot of our one-to-one executive coaching and support for individuals, but we collaborate on a lot of our consulting work with organizations, either, be it shaping their strategy, they haven't got one, or, moving it on, or trying to integrate some of these ideas into their existing provision. And the thing about Brave, I think the first two books were very much around, trying to get some rigor into managing stress in the workplace by understanding that, there are key sources of pressure for people, and that, as we said earlier on, pressure in itself is not bad. In fact, pressure, when it's appropriate to our coping strategies, can be very beneficial, because most of anything you've ever achieved in your life came by you being a little bit behind the curve, and having to raise your game and try different things. So pressure is a catalyst for personal and organizational growth. So we don't want to get rid of pressure. Pressure is a good thing. But there is a sweet spot, and if it exceeds people's ability to cope, that's where resilience comes in. Because if you can help people develop new ways of coping with pressure, external pressures, then actually their resilience grows and their ability the sweet spot moves. The pressure is the point at which the pressure curve dips away from growth down to strain and overwhelm actually gets extended. So that's where resilience training comes in. But what's happened, as I've already suggested, is in the first two books, we're really focusing on people measuring the sources of pressure and helping employees to address some of those things directly. But what's not necessarily wasn't thought about so much when those books were written, because they're actually probably 10, at least 15 years old now, is the impact that this concept of psychological safety has on people's ability to perform. And so the new book really looks more into that. It's just sort of like all the other stuff still applies in terms of helping people to become more resilient, but there's a big leadership component in terms of creating the right environment for people to feel able to share their ideas and contribute to building better well-being in the workplace. And that's really the clues on the front cover, that by doing some of these things, you can take pressure, which is a given and isn't going to go down anytime soon. In fact, it's only going to get worse in our VUCA world, with more uncertainty and volatility, and all these things create more pressures for people. More than ever, we need to work inside organizations that can create a local culture that's mirrored and modelled and acted on by senior leadership to recognise the value of the individual. And if you can do that, then you can liberate a lot of contribution and a lot of engagement and a lot of energy and sustain high performance inside an increasingly pressurized environment without people getting sick. Not doing it, which is what's happening in a lot of places, is the evidence is all there in the stress statistics. So the new one brings us more up to date, I suppose, with the current thinking around how to manage wellbeing more holistically, rather than just measuring how much of it you have and carting everyone off to counselling when it's too much. Oh, was that too much? So it's a little bit more focused on the leadership obligations, I think.
And where can the book be purchased? Is it all on the Amazons?
It's on Amazon, yeah. It's on Amazon. We're on socials as well. LinkedIn's probably the best place to find us, but we're on Facebook too. But LinkedIn is the main, and we obviously have our website. So nearly everything you could want to know about any of the things we've spoken about are probably on there.
Well, it's a huge thank you for chatting with me today, Lesley. I've had a greater insight on there's two sides of the story, obviously the individual and the organisation or the company. So I'll simply say thanks so much to Lesley Cooper of WorkingWell for chatting with me today on the Wellbeing for Work podcast. Once the podcast has been approved by Lesley, it'll be released for you all to listen to on social media and your favourite podcast channel. So thanks so much, Lesley, for chatting with me today.
Thank you. It's been lovely. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you.